There is a George Floyd protester who just recently got sentenced. In fact, it was today, and I'm talking specifically about Dylan Shakespeare Robinson out of Brainerd, Minnesota. If you recall, back in 2020, there was a lot of protests taking place all around the country in Portland and Minneapolis and different areas. And there was one incident that involved a group of individuals sort of attacking the Third Precinct out of Minneapolis. And this was sort of right around the same time that Kamala Harris was posting on her Twitter account saying things like, we want to, sort of get these people out of custody. And there was this alignment from many people in this country, sort of to back a lot of this activity. Sort of these protests, this unrest was legitimate because it was addressing racial issues that have been permeating throughout this country for a long period of time. And so some people were analyzing this, saying, oh, well, I wonder, what kind of penalties these protesters are going to get. Is it going to be the equivalent? We have sentencing guidelines and we have federal standards and misdemeanor standards and state standards and all sorts of different rules. So we just wanted to see whether or not this, what many people are characterizing as sort of a favored protest class, at least relative to maybe a disfavored class, which would be some people who are more on the right. Anybody who is supporting Trump is sort of lumped into this, insurrectionist group, while this other group is sort of this peaceful protest. CNN has the chyron running, so mostly peaceful protest as there's smoldering flames behind them, right? So there's sort of a wrapping in bubble wrap on one demographic versus another. Anyways, long story short, Dylan Shakespeare Robinson is one of those individuals, 23-year-old man sentenced to 4 years in prison. Now, what was his involvement? We're going to take a look at this. In 4 years, that's a pretty hefty fine, right, for protesting, or a hefty sentence. Then, in addition to that, he's going to be looking at $12 million that he's going to have to pay back for the restitution as a result of what happened. So this was a gentleman who was involved in apparently lighting a Molotov cocktail that was thrown at the Third Precinct that caught fire and then eventually ended up basically burning to the ground. So I want to go through this story just so we can sort of check in, see, how this sentence feels, whether it's excessive or light. We're going to start by going over to the New York Times. It says here, the burning of the police station after George Floyd's death draws a 4-year sentence. This was written over by Ozzy Paibara 2 days ago, April 28th. 3 days after George Floyd was killed in police custody in Minneapolis last year, the Third Precinct police building was set on fire. Thousands of protesters surrounded the building as it burned, sending giant orange flames and tall black clouds of smoke into the sky. So the whole precinct got basically torched. And it was interesting because the reaction, I think, by the media is very different on these two things. Now, they are different. Capitol Hill riots, of course, that is a federal building. That is the Capitol building of the country. It's a sacred building, but it is a government building, just like a police department is. And so, you hear a lot of claims of insurrection and overthrowing American democracy for the Capitol building, but not when it's a police station or even a federal courthouse, as we saw in Portland. So I just want to point that out there for those of you who don't already see it, which I'm sure you all do. So it says on Wednesday, 23-year-old man was sentenced to 4 years and then 2 years of supervised release for his role in setting the fire. That's really what we want to sort of ask ourselves. What was the role here? Was this a mastermind? Was this somebody who was there? Because we have also seen this same thing happen with the Capitol Hill rioters. There's been this tendency to charge people who were not even there. They were not even in the Capitol building. They're still being charged with crimes. We've covered several of them on this channel. They showed up the day after. They showed up that night after everything had already dissipated. But because they had some interaction with law enforcement, in close proximity to the main event, as it were, then they were sort of rounded up in the dragnet that was taking place around D.C. at that time. The man, Dylan Shakespeare of Robinson, Brainerd, he's about 120 miles north of Minneapolis. He's also ordered to pay $12 million in restitution. You think a 23-year-old kid has $12 million? Probably not. He pled guilty in December to one count of conspiracy to commit arson. 3 other men who also pled guilty to participating in the burning of the police building will be sentenced at a later date. So there were 3 other people there, according to Anders Folk, acting U.S. attorney out of District of Minnesota. William Mauzy, the lawyer for Robinson, said he was disappointed at the sentence his client received, considering the circumstances surrounding that fire. He said he is bearing the sentence for the other 1,000 people who participated. Mr. Mauzy said in an interview Wednesday night, many others far more culpable than Mr. Robinson were not identified. He had no role in throwing any Molotov cocktails or constructing any or building any. Right? That doesn't sound okay to me. And, if this is going to happen on or against people on the right, going to have an issue if this is happening with people on the left. Right now, this is his defense attorney, so of course you have to take this with a grain of salt. But on the sniff test, that passes, right? There were thousands of people around during the summer of unrest, the summer protests that were taking place there. And the government tends to do this. They just like to pick somebody and then make sure that they take the blame for everything, right? Rather than going out there and combing through all of those different protesters who were there when this happened back in May of last year or June, whenever it happened. They're not doing that, right? They are doing that with the Capitol Hill rioters. You see the FBI every day. Who's this person? Who's this person? We need the public's help. Who's this guy in the red hat and the blue hat and the green hat? Help us find everybody. Did they do that on this one? Or are they just going to pick a couple defendants and say, well, we got a picture of this guy, so we're going to make sure that he sort of takes the blame. They pick somebody up as the scapegoat, and they make sure that they can dogpile on that person. And I don't like when that happens to anybody, whether they're on the right or on the left, whether they are part of the MAGA group or part of the George Floyd protests. It is not okay either way. So let's go back. We have some more information. This comes over from twincities.com. It says, according to court documents, we want to look back on May 28th. Robinson, the person who was sentenced today, went to the Third Precinct, where a crowd of hundreds gathered following the murder of Floyd. One point, the crowd began shouting, "Burn it down, burn it down." Soon after, a fence designed to keep trespassers out of the Third Precinct was turned down. Robinson was torn down. Robinson, along with other co-conspirators, breached the fence, entered the building. Robinson, assisted by an unidentified co-conspirator, lit an object held by the unidentified co-conspirator, who threw it towards the Third Precinct building with the intent it would start the fire. He lit an object that was held by somebody else, right? So this guy just lit it. Somebody else threw it. All right, I know. On the night of May 28, 2020, Robinson chose to depart from lawful protest and instead engaged in violence and destruction. This is according to acting U.S. Attorney General. He said the arson at the Minneapolis Police Department put lives at risk, contributed to the widespread lawlessness in Minneapolis. With today's sentence, he's held accountable for his actions. ATF is committed to investigating the civil unrest arsons of 2020 that occurred throughout the Twin Cities, said a special agent. Arson is being inherently violent. It's a serious crime. The dangers posed by the defendant was very real. Today's sentencing sends a clear message that regardless of motivation, when someone is intent on conducting a violent act that breaks federal law, the FBI and our law enforcement partners will move assertively to hold them accountable. This type of behavior puts public servants and our entire community in danger, and we will simply not let it go unaddressed. All right, December 15, 2020, Robinson pled guilty to one count of conspiracy to commit arson. And so, this is a picture of it right here. So it looks like Robinson on the left, he's wearing a white shirt somewhere over here, might be over here, with a distinctive black stripe across the middle. Wait. Robinson on the left is wearing a white shirt with a distinctive black stripe across the middle and a black stocking cap. This image was taken May 28th from the Minneapolis Police Department surveillance video. The image was submitted with the initial criminal complaint against Robinson. So it's kind of making it sound like it's this guy right here, but that person is on the right, not on the left. So anyways, this is what you're looking at. This is probably the Molotov cocktail that, they're all sort of, lighting around and getting ready to throw it. And so, this is kind of a hefty sentence. Now, I've seen a lot of people on Twitter saying this is a very light sentence, and a lot of people sort of go, that's it, 4 years, right, for torching a whole police department? You should add a 0 to the end of that. I think Tim Pool said that it should be 40 years. And I'm thinking, all right, look, I understand it's a serious offense. I understand that arson, burning down a police department, is a big deal. But when you have a situation like this, I think that it is sort of hard to attribute it to one person. When you have a lot of people who are involved in this mob, activity, then it kind of makes sense, in my opinion, at least to divest or divert or dilute the share of the blame across a number of different defendants. And in this case, it sounds like, there was another person who actually threw it, but they didn't find that guy. He's unidentified. Nobody knows who he is. So isn't he more culpable than the other guy who just lit it? Right, and the kid's 23. I don't know what amount of mitigation that they presented to the court. I know this is probably a horribly unpopular opinion, but, I think that a lot of 23-year-old people make mistakes. Okay, when I was 18 to, high school and even in college, right, I was borderline, I could have done something like this. I maybe not quite like this, but, I could have done stuff that would have been certainly out of the ordinary. I think we all would have, right? When we were teenagers or in our 20s, there's sort of this period of, young person angst that we have, and if there's a big movement, if there's a big, bunch of people are all testosteroned up going out there and fighting, the power or whatever, I have some empathy for that, because I think that it captures a lot of people who are otherwise very good people who just, who made a mistake, got caught up with a bad group of people. And I certainly don't want to see their lives destroyed indefinitely. 4-year prison sentence, pretty reasonable. I mean, that's not that much time. He'll probably get out, sooner than that. The other thing that is a big sentence is a $12 million fine, right? He's never going to pay that back either, especially when he spends basically college in a federal prison. Mauzy, the defense attorney, says he expected the other defendants whom he is not representing to be sentenced to pay a portion of that restitution. There's no realistic chance that he is going to pay anything but a minuscule amount towards that. None of the defendants have an ability to pay a significant sum. Well, yeah, I mean, the response from the other side is going to say, well, they shouldn't have burnt down the police department. Okay, don't torch police buildings. Federal officials said in a criminal complaint last year that in the surveillance video at the precinct house, Robinson, quote, appears to light an incendiary device held by another person who later throws it at the building. Robinson was also captured on video setting fire inside the police station near a first floor stairwell. All right, so that's where it gets worse, right? So that's where I think more of that higher sentence is justified. Other evidence cited in the complaint came from a Snapchat account federal officials said was used by Robinson. In one video from that account that night, an unidentified female voice can be heard saying, Dylan, the complaint later said. Later, that Snapchat account typed in a message, said, we need gasoline. All right, so they're actively torching it, so maybe I'm eating my words on this one. Mr. Mauzy said officials later identified nearly 4 dozen separate places of origin for the fire that engulfed the station. That's a lot of different people setting fires at the various spots. Mr. Robinson was unfortunately one of the few who was captured on video and identified. So he is a little bit more culpable than I originally thought from that Twin Cities story. Brainerd man gets 4 years in prison. This is again from the Associated Press. $12 million bill for helping to firebomb. Sentence Wednesday, 4 years. So he's going to have to pay back the $12 million. Federal complaints. 3 other people have pled guilty in federal court, but they're awaiting sentencing. So this is interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like there were 4 co-defendants. And I can't tell if those 4 co-defendants or the 3 co-defendants to Mr. Robinson here, whether or not they, if any, it wouldn't have been. If any one of the, my question was any one of those people, any co-defendant, were they the unidentified person who was actually throwing the Molotov cocktail? But again, it doesn't really matter. I mean, if Robinson went inside the building and then started lighting things on fire and they've got video of that, yeah, I mean, 4 years sounds a lot more reasonable. Now, the other question would be, is the total restitution significantly more than 12 million? If it's 48 million, then you've got the total restitution divided by 4 co-defendants equally, or is it 12 million? He's just getting stuck with it. If he can't pay it, then it's going to be sort of joint and severally liable amongst the other co-defendants. So is it 12 divided by 4, or is it 48 divided by 4? We don't know. We have Jeremy Matrita in the house. Let's take a quick look at some of these comments. These should be good. We got Jeremy Matrita says, I hope you have a great week. I hope you did too there, Jeremy. What happens when a defendant receives a judgment they could never possibly pay back, such as with Robinson, and 12 million? So it's a good question. A couple things can happen. So, number one is they could garnish his wages basically indefinitely, right? Every time he, files taxes or receives a paycheck, they could just garnish that, right? So he basically is paying that back indefinitely. The other thing, so an enforcement mechanism that I have seen for these types of results is the court will sort of put a suspension on some of your civil privileges. So the one I'm talking about is driving. So I've seen this before. I don't do much civil law, as you know, but I've seen it in the past where somebody who owes somebody else money, if they don't pay that and a court has entered a judgment against them, the court, at least here in Arizona, will actually suspend that the party that is obligated to make the payment will suspend their license. So, I mean, they can't drive anywhere until they get that back in order, which can be a major penalty. But the downside of that, of course, is, well, what if you need to drive to go get a job so you can make some money to pay the money back? But you can't get a license to drive to go to that job. It's a problem. So the question is the government ever going to get $12 million back? Probably not. Good to see you, Jeremy. Hope your week was well, my friend. I'm glad that you're here. We have Chris John says, did people die in the burning? No, they didn't. It had all been evacuated at that point in time. So that's a good thing. Otherwise, he'd be facing murder charges, not just conspiracy for arson. We have Go Navy 505. What's up, Go Navy? He said, only discovered your channel recently, signed up right away. Yours is the only podcast that holds my interest for the duration. Well, I have a lot to live up to then, Go Navy. That's good. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm going to do my best. I'll be honest, sometimes I don't even hold my own interest, so I'll try not to do that. You can see me kind of get mad at stuff and kind of want to spiral off course. I go down these tangents and I go, oh yeah, I got to go back and talk about that other thing that's on my slides because I'm just so discombobulated at times. But see what's happening right now. I'm doing it right now. All right. So good, great questions. Good to have you here, Navy 505. Really appreciate it. All of those questions came over from watchingthewatchers.locals.com.